Thank you. I have a number of good Christian, let me make sure I get the right slides up here left. We'll let you do that, Jeff. I have a number of good Christian friends and family that if I were to say I get a chance to preach and I'm going to preach on rules, some of them would say, amen. I've got another group that if I said I'm going to preach on love, they would say, oh, amen. So today we're going to talk about both. So I don't know which parts you're going to appreciate, but I think that what's lovely about this is that there's a beautiful connectedness between rules and love. So today we're going to talk about rule number 1, I believe, is love. And rule number 2 and those beyond involves looking at rule number 1. The story that I'm going to spend most of today talking about is the man with the withered hand. And this was a miracle that's in 3 of the Gospels. All the Gospels but John write about this. And I'm going to read the first section here from Matthew and from Mark, since there's some important pieces that I think it's important for us to understand. So if you want to turn or listen, Matthew 12, 9 through 14. Going on from that place, he went into their synagogue, and a man with a shriveled hand was there. Looking for a reason to bring charges against Jesus, they asked him, is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath? He said to them, if any of you has a sheep and it falls into a pit on the Sabbath, will you not take hold of it and lift it out? How much more valuable is a person than a sheep? Therefore it is lawful to do good on the Sabbath. Then he said to the man, stretch out your hand. So he stretched it out and was completely restored, just as sound as the other. But the Pharisees went out and plotted how they might kill Jesus. Similar in Mark 3, 1-6. Another time Jesus went into the synagogue and a man with a shriveled hand was there. Some of them were looking for a reason to accuse Jesus, so they watched him closely to see if he would heal him on the Sabbath. Jesus said to the man with the shriveled hand, stand up in front of everyone. Then Jesus asked them, which is lawful on the Sabbath, to do good or to do evil, to save life or to kill? But they remained silent. He looked around at them in anger and deeply distressed at their stubborn hearts, said to the man, stretch out your hand. He stretched it out and his hand was completely restored. Then the Pharisees went and began to plot with the Herodians how they might kill Jesus. So there's several aspects here we're going to talk about. It's one of the few times in the Bible that Jesus is mentioned as being angry. It's also one of the few times that one of the people that Jesus is healing on the Sabbath is called out in front of everybody. Stand up, come to the front of the class. So I want to look at this same story from 3 different perspectives. I want to look at it from the perspective of the man, the perspective of the Pharisees, and finally the perspective of Jesus. So let's start with the man. So often the focus of the stories and the healings and the miracles we look at is on Jesus, and then how the Pharisees deal with that. I think it's important for us to understand those that are being healed, those that are touched by Jesus, because there is some risk and there is some danger to being touched by Jesus. So the reputational risk. Many scholars believe that this story, this miracle, took place after John 5. And John 5 was the lame man that was healed by the pool of Bethesda. What was interesting about this is Jesus again first asks permission. He asks the man at the pool of Bethesda, do you want to get well? And we know the story. He says, yes, but I can't get in the water soon enough. So after he's healed, Jesus says, pick up your mat and go on your way. And you remember, the Pharisees saw him walking with a mat, and they didn't say, praise God, you're walking, or it's amazing, we have never seen your walk. Do you remember what they said? You can't carry the mat on Sabbath. What are you doing? He said, well, I was healed. The man told me to do that. And they said, who did this? And put down that mat. So there was some reputational risk, and there was some precedent already around being healed by Jesus, specifically on the Sabbath. Additionally, there's a social and religious status risk that comes from being touched by Jesus. And you see this later in John 5, the story of the blind man that was healed. Not only was this man healed by Jesus, you remember this. He gets down, spits in the mud, uses the mud to heal the eyes, and this man is so blessed. So what do the Pharisees do? They don't just question the man, they call in his family and say, family, do you know what happened here? Was he really blind? Tell us more about this. And the family, not wanting to ruffle too many feathers with the church, says, well, all we'll say is, yes, he was blind from birth. They called the man in, and the man not only stands his ground on being healed, but stands his ground on why he was healed and who healed him. And what happened to the man? It says in the Bible, the Pharisees hurled insults at him, and he was excommunicated. There is some risk from being touched by Jesus. So part of the question I think that we need to ask as we look at this is, would you be healed? And that may sound like a silly question, but you have to understand the risk and danger that comes from this. I was talking to somebody ahead of time and said, could being healed lead to your death or even worse? And people said, well, what could be worse than death? Well, and again, if you're of the belief that being part of the church is contingent on you being healed, being excommunicated could be worse than death, for what some people would consider that. I've tried to find pictures of miracles. I love the pictures, not only the modern day ones, but the ones from the 1890s or the 1800s. And I found this picture of the man, and I'm going to pull out this part from Luke where he gets and says, get up and stand in front of everyone. Come up in front of the synagogue. And there's this picture of the man standing there with Jesus. And you can't see this well, so I zoomed in a little bit. And I love this because Jesus, as typically depicted and illustrated, has a kind face and is smiling. How excited does the man look? There is some real fear and he's not thinking, boy, this is going to be great. He's got some trepidation and fear right there. And I could almost see myself in that position saying to Jesus, boy, I would love to get this healed. Any chance we could do this out back? Like, we're in the synagogue. That's kind of a big deal. Even better, could you come back tomorrow? Because this was one of those statement miracles that Jesus had, where not only did he heal somebody, he did it on the Sabbath, and he called attention to it in front of the synagogue. I believe this is the miracle, from what I've been reading, that afterwards you saw the Pharisees started planning to kill Jesus. So would you be healed? What would you do in a situation like that? I think we need to look at it from the perspective of the man. Now the Pharisees, this is the part I can get myself in trouble, because I've got a confession to make. I love rules, right? Admitting it is the first part, though, right? You're going to help me get where I need to be with this. But I love rules. I even love driving rules. How sad is that? I love to stop at stop signs. I blink all the time. I love to figure out the right way to merge. That's crazy. Now, you see this wonderful picture of how to merge. If you don't let people in, there's another sermon for you. It's the woe sermon, woe to you. But that's not today's sermon. The point of this is that I love driving. I love the rules behind it. In fact, when I first took my driving exam, my parents made me drive 2,000 miles with them before I took the test. 500 miles in inclement weather, 500 miles on the highway. So by the time I took my test, I was on it. I was ready. And I remember I had a tough teacher. So I took this test, and at the end of the test, the person said, there's nothing I can mark you off for. And I thought, oh, that's great. And he says, but I never give a perfect test. So you didn't look down the alleyways when you passed those. And he checked it off. Can you believe that? I have looked down every alleyway since that, at least twice while I'm driving by. One of my favorite stories is I was driving with a colleague of mine in high school, and we were driving and we passed a cop. And when we passed the cop, he looked down and saw that he was speeding. And so do you know what he did? He pulled himself over. My friend saw he was speeding, and he pulled over and just sat at the side of the road and waited for the cop to come behind us. The cop walked up and said, license and registration. And he said, I got to tell you, I've never seen anyone pull themselves over before. He says, I can't give you a ticket. This is going to be the best story that I tell all my coworkers. But I love the rules, and there's importance to rules. Some of the other rules that I love, games, board games. If there's something that it would be fun for you to know about me, I love board games. This is a picture of one of the shelves in the basement. And I won't tell you that there are 2 or 3 other shelves that look similar to this. But I love board games, all the strategy ones you may have never heard of. Monopoly, that's pretty fun. Risk. But we've got Carcassonne, we've got Shadows, we've got all these fun strategy games. And my wife makes fun of me when I get a game, because my favorite part of opening a new game, I'll pull it up there, and I'll start pulling off the wrapping of it. I'll open it up and put it aside, and these are some intense games. These are 4 of the games we have. You can see they've got different lands. They've got spaceships. They've got different figures, characters, and I take all of these, and I put them aside, and I pull out the rule book. And she says, what's wrong with you? You're sick. This is cool. Why aren't you looking at this? And I said, I got to read the rules. This is the most important part of the game. And I do that because I want to find an advantage. I need to know how to win. And it's not that I withhold any rules from anybody else, but boy, if I know them the best, I have an advantage in that game. And that may be a good strategy for board games. You may end up sleeping on the couch once or twice in your life, but that is not a good strategy for life. The last thing I'll tell from the personal side of it is my career choice, right? And it sounds like I love rules. I think all of us love rules to some form or fashion. Now, I work in human resources, and I hate to say it, but as going through archaic, the old pictures you can find, I believe that human resources were the Pharisees of the common day workplace. I found this picture with the arch. It says human resources, at least it's close enough, and I'm going to take credit for that. But I work at Adventist Healthcare, and we have the Code of Conduct. And in this Code of Conduct, we've got all the rules of how you should behave and shouldn't behave in the workplace. And we've got 3 different ways that we know whether to write you up, give you a warning, coach you, or to fire you. We've got 19 Category 1 offenses, 23 Category 2 offenses, 28 Category 3 offenses, and if that wasn't enough, we have 5 Category 0 offenses, which is if you're not even at work and you misbehave, what we need to be concerned about. Now, these aren't bad. These help add order to the workplace, but you can see that I love rules probably more than I should. So, Pharisees love the rules. And I think, again, to a certain extent, we probably love rules too. Now, I don't have proof of this, but I believe that many of the Pharisees missed the miracle that we just talked about. And I love this picture. You see on the side this man that is reaching out for the first time in his life with a restored and stretched out arm, and you can see the crowd is all looking at him. You see Jesus is facing him, but is turned to the Pharisees. And the Pharisees are holding their scrolls. And what I'm pretty sure happened here was, if you remember, Jesus asked them a question. If any of you has a sheep and it falls into a pit on the Sabbath, will you not take hold of it and lift it out? And he asked this as a question leading into his miracle, but I'm pretty sure a lot of the Pharisees said, whoa, that is a good question. Let's figure that out. They went and started going through the scrolls, and so Jesus performs this miracle, and I see them tugging on his shoulder and turning to look at them and them saying, hey, what color was the sheep? Was it a white sheep? Was it a black sheep? Was it an ornery sheep? What kind of temperament did it have? Was it an old sheep? Was it a young sheep? Was it a pregnant sheep? And I can see Jesus saying, guys, it's not about the sheep. And so they huddle and say, okay, you're right. Talk to us about the pit. What was at the bottom of the pit? Was there water at the bottom of the pit? Was it a dangerous pit? How deep was the pit? If we left him there overnight, would he be comfortable? And Jesus says it's not about the sheep, it's not about the pit. But I believe that the Pharisees missed the miracle because they were so focused on the law. And I would ask us, how often do we miss out on love because we're so focused on the laws? There's a beautiful passage in the Mount of Blessing that says, for seeing that they fail to keep the law, they will devise rules and regulations of their own to try and force themselves to obey. All of this turns the mind away from God to self. His love dies out of the heart, and with it perishes love for his fellow man. Now, something that I think is so interesting when we look at the rules and the laws, and these are important, but we look at it as if it's an earthly, humanly rule. We have to remember that we have the Scriptures, we have the Bible, but God is a universal God. God is bigger than earth. God is bigger than humans, and he loves us all. But I believe that we have been given a glimpse in how the universe acts, how God governs. God is love, and I believe that that is a way of showing us how God runs the universe. And what's interesting about us, and I think part of the problems that we have, is that God says to us, this is the rule. The rule is love. I'm going to keep it simple for you, but it's the most important rule. And we say, that's hard. I don't know if can you give us some more information? We need more details. So God says, okay, the verse we read today, love God and love man. I'll try and keep it simple for you. We say, no, we need more details. We got to figure this out more. And so God actually gives us the 10 Commandments, which if you boil down to it, is 4 ways to love God. Love me exclusively. Love me directly. Love me sincerely. Love me totally. And 6 ways to love man. Honor your parents. Don't murder. Don't commit adultery. Don't steal. Don't testify falsely. And don't covet other stuff. And you'd think that we'd be like, all right, this is good. This is enough details. We can live with this. But if you read through the Bible, we ended up with 613 ceremonial laws after that. Now this, what I love about looking at this, is I kind of see this as if it's an eye test, right? Now, I like that. You can barely see anything. Wear your glasses. Okay, we get that. But if you look at it, the more things that you start adding underneath this, you lose sight of what's at the top. And if God says this is important, it's important. And everything we add underneath it takes away from what we're trying to see at the top and what God's asking us to spend time with. Another couple quick passages out of Desire of Ages. The Jewish leaders accomplished the will of Satan by surrounding God's rest day with burdensome requirements. In the days of Christ, the Sabbath had become so perverted that its observance reflected the character of selfish and arbitrary men rather than the character of a loving Heavenly Father. It is the service of love that God values. When this is lacking, the mere round of ceremony is an offense to Him. So it was with the Sabbath. It was designed to bring men into communion with God and each other. But when the mind was absorbed with wearisome rites, the object of the Sabbath was thwarted, and its mere outward observance was a mockery. So here's part of the issue. The problem isn't the rules, right? We talked about that. If you go back and want to look at some prioritization and look at the biblical and medieval communication to understand how we should prioritize rules, the first thing that royalty would do if they had a law, a decree that they wanted to put out there, is they would dictate the decree to scribes. And you would have either a scribe or a number of scribes that would write this out while you were doing that. If it was even more important, you actually had the ability to seal it with your ring and your decree. And we can read this multiple times throughout the Bible where it's sealed with a ring or a signet. If it was even more important, and this is more rarely seen, the king or the person, the queen, would write it personally. And there's a couple of fun examples modern day that you can look at this. King Henry VIII, I think it was, wrote several of his decrees in person, wrote some letters to Anne Boleyn in person. We won't go into that. But there were some important things that were so confidential or important to the king that he wrote them himself. The second one is actually one of my favorites. It's a handwritten memo from Winston Churchill. And for those of you who know the history of World War II, there was a letter that he got from his private secretary that said, as you're coming in as prime minister, we think it's important that you should negotiate. Find a way out of the war. Don't come into any more ridicule. And he hand wrote something back that said, I'm ashamed that you would even write this to me. I'm sending it back with this letter so you can burn them both. But if it's so important that you take time to write it, that tells us a great deal about what you're trying to say. Can you think of anything else that was written that is so important that we need to be aware of? God's law. The Ten Commandments, God personally wrote that. He had to write it twice, if we're being honest with ourselves. So it's not that the rules aren't important, but you need to understand the prioritization of this. Now what's interesting is you can actually go back and see in medieval times when it was the most important, they did not want to miss this, they would send their son. They would send their family. And there's two instances I found. One was Prince John of Lancashire and Prince Louis of France. But the premise of this is the symbolism. It emphasizes the importance. I am sending my son. This is important. You can't miss this. The second was the security. They were less likely to be intercepted or harmed if you sent your son. The third was authority. You lent authority to the messenger. And if that person needed to come and change any part of what they were saying, they had the authority to do that. They weren't acting on behalf of the king. They were part of that same bloodline of the king. So you see where I'm going with this. The problem isn't the rules, and I'm not discounting any of the rules that we have. In fact, they're so important that God personally wrote them. But if you think about the importance of that, love was so important that God personally sent His only Son to teach us and show us how. So Jesus is His perspective in this miracle and in this story. One of the things we always look at in healthcare, I've worked in healthcare for about 20 years. We've talked about not only when are you open at night, when are you open on Sabbath, Sunday, all those things. One of the questions we ask is it urgent? Is it emergent? Is it a trauma? Did somebody, just break their leg? Is it a gunshot wound? Is it something that this person is going to have serious harm or die if we don't take care of it right away? So if you look at the story of the man with the withered hand, is this person going to die if it's not fixed right now? No. He's been that way since the beginning. So you can't say, well, God was doing this right now. He was making a statement by doing this on the Sabbath in front of everybody. It's not urgent, emergent. Making a statement. Now, maybe, do we want to just pretend for a second, maybe Jesus didn't know about the rules, not to do this on the Sabbath. He wrote the Ten Commandments. And if you actually go to the verses right before this, they had just been giving him a hard time because he was walking through the wheat fields and they were picking from the wheat on the way. And they said, you can't do that on the Sabbath. I can almost see Jesus thinking, well, wait until you follow me into the synagogue. What's interesting is, again, this is one of the few times you see that Jesus was angry. Very rarely does it talk about this. But there's a counterpoint in this same story, in that the Pharisees were also furious in the story. And I look at this as such good news for every single one of us. When the Pharisees were angry, what did they do? They left and planned to kill somebody. When Jesus was angry, what did he do? He loved the sinner and healed the person. The statement I think Jesus was making is, I am love and I love you, and my love for you is stronger than any love in the universe. As we look at trying to kind of summarize and bring pieces of this together, I think it's important for us to understand that we live not on an earth, not on a planet that's governed by love, but in a universe that's governed by love. And it's not just rule number 1. I think it's the foundation of every rule that we have. And you can see that in the verse that we read today from Matthew 22, where it even says, love the Lord your God completely, love your neighbor as yourself. But you can see that there's an important foundation to this in all the other rules. John 15:14, if you love me, keep my commandments. It's not saying don't keep my commandments, it's saying keep my commandments, but why? Why should you keep my commandments? Because I said so? Because of love, because you love me. So again, the takeaways that I get from this that just encourage me, as I lean in, is the man. Accepting God's love, and letting him touch your heart requires some action and comes with some risk. But it is so worth it. The Pharisees, don't lose sight of the miracles for the sheep and the pits. And again, as we said, you could even look at that another way. Don't lose sight and set love aside for the laws. And finally, Jesus, I am love. God is love. I love that verse in 1 John. And I love you. And my love for you is stronger than any law in the universe.